Hi, my name is Emily Hale. On the day I married the love of my life, my parents didn't just refuse to walk me down the aisle, they called my wedding an embarrassment. For years, I lived in their shadow, always treated as less than until one moment changed everything. If this kind of story resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Let's begin. From the outside, the Hale estate looked like a dream, but inside, I lived as the family's greatest disappointment. I learned that lesson early. Every hallway gleamed with imported marble, every chandelier dripped with crystal, and every guest who crossed our threshold left dazzled. Yet beneath that brilliance, I moved like a shadow, always aware that my presence was tolerated, never celebrated. My parents, Charles and Margaret Hale, had built their empire on appearances Boston's most prestigious real estate developers, lords of Beacon Hill soirees, arbiters of social currency. And me, I was the smudge on their perfect glass. They never said it outright when I was a child. Instead, their disappointment dripped through the cracks of carefully chosen words. Emily, sit properly. Watch how Victoria greets our guests. Graceful, charming. My mother's voice, honey-laced with venom, echoed through every banquet. I would clutch the hem of my dress, trying to fold myself into something smaller, quieter, less me. My father rarely looked up from his wine glass except to nod approvingly when Victoria performed her role as the golden child. My birthdays became rehearsals in humiliation. On my 16th, I unwrapped an envelope containing $50 and a polite nod from my father. 3 months later, Victoria stepped outside to find a brand new BMW convertible gleaming in the driveway, a red bow fluttering in the spring breeze. Cameras flashed, relatives applauded, and my parents toasted to our darling star. I stood in the corner, clutching my crumpled bill, pretending it didn't burn in my hand. That was the first time my father whispered something I'll never forget. Victoria is our pride. Emily, safer when she stays silent. The words weren't meant for me to hear, but I did. They branded me. Still, I tried. I thought if I worked harder, achieved more, they might finally see me. In high school, I buried myself in books while Victoria floated through parties. I graduated valedictorian, clutching a speech I had rehearsed for weeks. The auditorium roared when my name was called. But when I turned to the front row, my parents' seats were empty. They had left after the opening remarks, racing to a charity gala. Later, my mother breezed into my room, jewels still glittering on her wrist. We already heard your speech during rehearsal, darling. The Williams Foundation needed us tonight. She said it like an explanation. To me, it felt like a verdict. College carved the divide even deeper. Despite their millions, my parents told me it builds character as they refused to pay my tuition. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore, juggling shifts with lectures, stacking books long past midnight, surviving on instant noodles. Victoria, meanwhile, breezed through NYU's fashion marketing program with her tuition rent and credit cards funded by a trust. Spring breaks in Cancun, summers in Paris, shopping sprees on Fifth Avenue. My sister floated on a cushion of luxury while I calculated whether I could afford bus fare. When my laptop died junior year, I saved for 3 months to replace it. Victoria mentioned she needed one during a dinner call. That same night, my father ordered the newest MacBook Pro with every upgrade. She needs powerful tools for design work, my mother explained. You just read. I told myself I no longer cared, but resentment simmered sharp and corrosive. Every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night proved that my worth could never breach their fortress of appearances. My Uncle Robert was the lone reprieve. He saw me, not the other daughter, not the afterthought. He came to every recital, every science fair, every quiet milestone my parents dismissed. When I broke down after discovering they wouldn't attend my graduation dinner, he put a steady hand on my shoulder. Emily, you are more than their blindness. Don't let them define you. He was the only one who ever said words like that aloud. After college, I built a life of my own in Cambridge. A modest apartment, secondhand furniture, and pride in every piece I paid for myself. My parents visited, once looked around with thin smiles and murmured, "At least you're responsible." That word again. Responsible. Never extraordinary, never brilliant, never worthy. Always the safe, silent one. Looking back now, I can see the foreshadowing. My parents' obsession with image, their ability to lavish everything on Victoria while rationing scraps of affection for me, was always leading towards something crueler. They had rehearsed the words for decades, training themselves on smaller cuts before wielding the blade that would slash deepest. "We won't be embarrassed with you." I didn't know then that one day they'd aim that sentence at the most sacred moment of my life. But even in those early years, there were cracks in my resignation. Nights when I lay awake replaying my father's careless murmur, "Victoria is our pride." Emily, safer when she stays silent, and felt a tremor of defiance. A whisper that maybe someday I would no longer stay quiet. I thought I had accepted my role as the family's shadow, but fate had other plans. Everything began with a burst pipe and ended with a man who turned my life upside down. I had grown so accustomed to silence that the sound of rushing water startled me more than it should have. It was a Tuesday evening, rain streaking against my apartment windows when a sharp hiss erupted from the bathroom. By the time I reached the door, water was already pooling across the tiles, spreading like a fast-moving shadow into my bedroom carpet. Panic clawed at my chest. I grabbed my phone, dialed the emergency plumber service, and prayed someone would come before my little apartment drowned. 50 minutes later, there was a knock. I opened the door to find a tall man with warm brown eyes and a calm, steady smile. His boots dripped with rain. His polo shirt carried the stitched name Wilson Plumbing, and his hands were rough yet clean. "Daniel Carter," he introduced himself, voice low and reassuring. "Heard you've got a flood on your hands." Something in his tone, competence wrapped in kindness, steadied me. He crouched by the pipe, turned the valve with practiced hands, and within minutes the chaos slowed. As he worked, we talked. Not the awkward small talk I dreaded, but real conversation. He asked about my bookshelves lined with worn novels and technical journals. When I mentioned my job in financial consulting, his eyes lit with curiosity rather than boredom. He asked sharp questions about market trends, about cycles of growth and collapse, even drawing parallels to a biography he had just finished. I found myself laughing at his quick wit, marveling at how his words carried both humor and depth. By the time he wiped his hands clean and handed me his card, I knew something had shifted. That week, I kept the card tucked in my wallet, glancing at it more often than I admitted. When he called 2 days later, not about plumbing, but about continuing a conversation on history over coffee, I said yes before I could overthink. Our first date was supposed to be an hour. It stretched into 4 inside a cozy coffee shop smelling of cinnamon and old wood. We spoke of everything: literature, music, the absurdity of social hierarchies. He listened in a way no one in my family ever had, not to weigh my worth, but to understand me. I left that night with a warmth blooming inside me I hadn't known was possible. Weeks passed and we carved out a rhythm. Afternoons spent wandering bookstores, evenings walking along the Charles River, mornings sharing bagels at a corner cafe. His laughter filled the empty spaces in my life. In him, I found what I had never received from my parents' recognition, not as a disappointment, but as someone worthy. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. Still, I dreaded the moment my two worlds would collide. And inevitably, it came. When I told my parents I wanted to bring Daniel to dinner at the Hale estate, silence stretched over the phone. Finally, my mother's clipped voice replied, "Of course, darling. Bring him." The pause before her words made my stomach twist. That evening, Daniel and I walked into the Beacon Hill mansion, its marble floors, gleaming chandeliers, glittering like cruel stars. Victoria floated into the foyer, first dressed in silk that whispered money, Bradley Mason at her side, smirking with effortless arrogance. "So this is the boyfriend," she said, eyes flicking over Daniel with a smile too sharp. My parents greeted us with rehearsed warmth. Margaret leaned in for an air kiss, her perfume suffocating. Charles clasped Daniel's hand just long enough to be polite, his gaze already drifting toward Bradley, as if Daniel were a placeholder rather than a man. The long mahogany table glittered with silverware and crystal. But as we sat, the air grew taut. Conversation revolved around Bradley's travels, Paris, Milan, exclusive ski resorts. Victoria spoke of fashion shows, of champagne in penthouses. My father beamed at every word. When Daniel politely tried to add to the discussion, mentioning a museum exhibit, we had seen Charles cut him off to ask Bradley about a new business connection. My cheeks burned as Daniel fell silent, yet his expression remained calm, unbothered. Midway through dinner, Margaret drew me into the kitchen under the guise of helping with dessert. She leaned close, her voice lowered to a sharp whisper. "Darling, a plumber, what will our friends say?" The words pierced me more deeply than I wanted to admit. I wanted to shout that Daniel was brilliant, that he could quote philosophy and design complex systems, that he saw me in ways they never had. But my tongue felt heavy, trapped by decades of conditioning. Margaret smoothed her pearls, satisfied with my silence, and swept back to the dining room. When we returned, I caught Daniel's eyes. He gave me a small, reassuring smile as if to say he knew exactly what had been said. Somehow that hurt and comforted me at once. The evening dragged on, filled with false laughter and knives hidden in compliments. As dessert plates were cleared, my father rose, crystal glass in hand. His voice boomed across the table, every word heavy with performance. To Victoria, he declared, eyes fixed on her. Our daughter, who has never once embarrassed us. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't look at me. But the message was carved into the silence, undeniable and cruel. On the most important day of my life, the front row seats reserved for my parents remained empty. I had told myself not to hope. I had rehearsed the moment in my head, steadying my heart against the familiar ache of disappointment. Yet as the August sun dipped low over Riverside Gardens, painting the Charles River with streaks of gold, I couldn't stop my eyes from searching. 2 white chairs in the front row sat untouched, their satin ribbons fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. They looked less like reserved seats and more like gravestones, memorials to the love I would never receive. The night before, I had called one last time. My voice shook as I asked Will, "You be there tomorrow?" My mother's reply had come crisp, practiced like lines she had rehearsed. "Darling, your father has a critical meeting with investors from Dubai. We really cannot miss it." A lie so thin it collapsed under its own weight. The gala, the so-called obligations, always something more important than me. I had ended the call with a hollow calm, a shield forged from years of rejection. But even shields crack when struck in the right place. Now standing in a small dressing room as my best friend adjusted my veil, the shield gave way. I stared at my reflection, a simple ivory gown lace edging my shoulders, my eyes rimmed red from tears I had sworn I wouldn't shed. The phone buzzed in my hand and I answered with shaking fingers. My mother's voice slipped through the line like venom disguised as silk. "Emily and Joy marrying your plumber. We won't be embarrassed with you." Something inside me shattered and something else at the same time solidified. It was the cruelty I had feared most. Not indifference, but disdain. They weren't simply absent. They were ashamed of me. My throat closed. My knees gave out and I sank onto a chair, sobs racking my chest. Then came the soft knock. "Emily." My Uncle Robert's voice carried a steadiness that pulled me back from the edge. When I opened the door, he stood there, eyes kind, shoulders strong. "Your father called me," he said quietly. "Told me he wouldn't come. Said he couldn't." His lips pressed into a thin line. "He asked if I would check on you." I told him he was making the gravest mistake of his life. He extended his arm, eyes glistening. "So if you'll let me, I'd be honored to walk you down the aisle." Tears returned, but this time they tasted of gratitude, not despair. I would love that I whispered, clinging to him as though he were the lifeline I had always needed. When the music swelled and the guests rose, I stepped out into the garden. Lanterns strung between trees bathed the aisle in a soft glow. Wildflowers lined the path, and the scent of summer clung to the air. At the end, Daniel waited, his smile steady, his eyes wet with his own tears. Each step I took with Robert felt like a declaration I was not abandoned, not alone, not invisible. The ceremony unfolded with a kind of fragile perfection. Daniel and I exchanged vows, our voices trembling with emotion but unwavering in promise. Friends cheered, laughter mingled with the hum of cicadas, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my parents' absence lift just enough to breathe. When Daniel's hands closed around mine, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Yet in the shadows of joy, pain still lurked. At the reception, after the dancing and toasts, I slipped away to a quiet corner, phone in hand. The sting of my mother's words lingered. I thought of the empty seats of the disdain etched in her voice. Then I thought of Daniel, of the man who had been dismissed, belittled, unseen. My parents believed they had defined his worth. They had no idea how wrong they were. Across the garden pavilion, Daniel laughed with a group of old colleagues from MIT. Above them hung a banner, simple yet unmistakable congratulations, Daniel Carter, CEO of Hydrocore Systems. The sight filled me with a fierce, unexpected pride. He was more than what they mocked, more than what they refused to see. Without hesitation, I snapped a photo. My thumb hovered for only a second before I pressed send to both of my parents. No caption, no explanation, just the truth wrapped in a single image. The message went through instantly, the screen glowing with confirmation. I turned the phone face down, my heart pounding. For once, I didn't need their approval. What I sent wasn't a plea, it was a reckoning. The morning after the wedding, my phone buzzed with headlines that would change everything. I was still half asleep, sunlight spilling in through the blinds of our Boston apartment when the vibration wouldn't stop. I reached for the phone on the nightstand, blinking against the screen's glow. The first headline seared into me like a branding iron. MIT engineer secures $10 million investment for Hydrocore Systems. Another followed, Hydrocore wins harborfront redevelopment contract. The articles multiplied with every refresh, Daniel's name, Daniel's photo, Daniel's story plastered across the Boston Business Journal, Forbes Online. Even LinkedIn feeds flooded with congratulations. Beside me, Daniel stirred, brushing his hand against my arm. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I whispered, handing him the phone with trembling fingers. "Everything's finally right." His smile was quiet, grounded, the same smile he'd worn fixing a burst pipe in my apartment months ago. To the world, he had just become a rising star in sustainable engineering. To me, he was still the man who noticed when I skipped meals, who listened when my voice broke, who read with me until I fell asleep. The rest of Boston could keep its headlines. I already knew his worth. By noon, messages flooded my own phone. Friends from college sent screenshots of the news. Clients from work wrote, "You married him, incredible." Even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years wanted to bask in the glow of my husband's success. Every ping brought a rush of vindication and a sharp stab of anger. Because the only people I longed to hear from were the ones who had called my wedding an embarrassment. They didn't disappoint. By early evening, the Hale name was being whispered in the same circles where it once commanded respect. My parents' carefully curated image was crumbling. I heard from a cousin that Charles and Margaret had been cornered at a country club brunch, asked bluntly, "How could you dismiss the man spearheading the harborfront project?" The same guests who once admired their auteur now laughed behind manicured hands. My parents' pride was hemorrhaging in public, and it was Daniel's truth, our truth, that had cut them open. At 7 sharp, the doorbell rang. Daniel and I exchanged a glance. He rose, shoulders relaxed, and opened the door. There stood Charles and Margaret Hale, polished as ever, dressed for an evening gala, though their smiles faltered at the edges. My mother clutched a glossy gift bag. My father held a bottle of champagne so expensive it probably cost more than my first car. "Emily, darling," my mother cooed, sweeping forward with open arms, the same arms that had been folded in disapproval at every milestone of my life. I accepted the hug stiffly, then stepped back to Daniel's side. They moved into our apartment, their eyes scanning the modest space as if cataloging its inadequacies. My father cleared his throat. "We owe you both an apology." "Do you?" I asked evenly. My mother tried a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "We misjudged Daniel. We should have recognized his brilliance sooner." Her gaze slid to him like a predator spotting prey dressed in silk. "And now that Hydrocore has the harborfront contract, I think there may be opportunities for us to support one another. Imagine Hale Properties and Hydrocore collaborating on eco-friendly luxury housing. The possibilities are endless." There it was, the pivot, the transaction, the real reason for their sudden appearance. Not regret. Not love. Leverage. Daniel leaned back against the sofa, utterly unshaken. "Harborfront's already secured," he said, voice calm, measured, undeniable. "We didn't just win the bid. We signed the deal. Construction begins next quarter." the silence was thick enough to smother. My father's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as if he'd swallowed poison. For years, he had boasted about pursuing the harborfront redevelopment, the jewel of Boston's future. Now it belonged to his son-in-law, the plumber he had once dismissed. My mother recovered, first clasping her hands. Then, perhaps, that's even more reason to work together. I stared at them, the same faces that had turned away from me at graduations, at birthdays, at my wedding. "No," I said quietly, each word honed to a blade. "You're not sorry for how you treated him. You're sorry you underestimated him. There's a difference." Their smiles flickered, fractured, fell away. And in that moment, I felt something I had never felt in their presence before: power. "You don't regret how you treated him." I repeated, my voice steady, my chest finally free of the old ache. "You only regret underestimating him." At 2 a.m, my phone rang. It was Victoria, and she was crying. The sound startled me awake, cutting through the stillness of our Cambridge home. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Victoria never cried. She performed, laughed too loudly at parties, whispered cutting remarks behind champagne flutes, but tears. They were foreign to her face. Her voice trembled through the line, raw and stripped of all the polish she had once perfected. "Emily, they took everything." I sat upright, clutching the phone tighter. "Who did the FBI?" she whispered. "Bradley, he's under investigation. Fraud, a Ponzi scheme. They raided our apartment, they froze our accounts. I don't even have—" She choked on a sob. "A place to stay." Images flashed unbidden: Victoria at that dinner months ago, flashing her diamond ring while sneering at Daniel's blue-collar job. The sister whose birthday was celebrated with convertibles while mine was marked with envelopes of cash. The golden child who basked in our parents' approval while I withered in its absence. And now she was calling me from the ruins of her kingdom, the shine stripped from her crown. "Come here," I said before I could think. "Pack what you can and come here." By dawn, Victoria appeared at my doorstep, 2 suitcases in hand, her hair tangled, her designer coat hanging limply off her shoulders. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She looked less like the Victoria Hale of glossy magazines and more like a lost child. Daniel brought her a blanket and tea without hesitation. She sank into our couch, clutching the cup as though it might keep her from drowning. "They knew," she murmured. "Bradley controlled the finances. I signed whatever he put in front of me. I thought I was living the dream." "You were living his dream," Daniel said gently, though his eyes were steady. "Not yours." She broke down again, covering her face with her hands. "Our parents, they told me not to come home. They said they couldn't be associated with the scandal. That I was on my own." The words cut me in a way I hadn't expected. The same parents who had disowned me emotionally for years were now disowning her in the most public moment of her downfall. I should have felt vindication. Instead, I felt something closer to sorrow. Because for all her cruelty, Victoria was as much a product of them as I was. That evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her mascara smudged her once perfect nails, bitten to the quick. "You know what's funny?" She whispered, her voice hoarse. "All my life, I thought you were the family embarrassment. The one people whispered about. But it's me. I'm the shameful one." The confession hit harder than any insult she had ever hurled at me. For the first time, she wasn't my rival. She was my sister. I reached across the table, took her trembling hand, and held it tight. "You're not shameful. You were lied to, manipulated. That doesn't make you weak. It makes him a predator." Her tears fell freely, then soaking the space between our clasped hands. And in that moment, I realized I was giving her something our parents had never given me: unconditional support. Victoria stayed in our guest room, slowly piecing herself back together. She helped cook, she folded laundry. She even asked Daniel questions about hydrocore, listening to him with a respect she had once reserved only for men like Bradley. There was no trace of the golden child anymore, only a woman learning painfully what mattered. But just as the fragile peace began to settle, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. His voice was clipped, urgent. "Emily, we need Daniel's help. Hale Properties is bleeding. If hydrocore doesn't step in, we won't survive. My father once seemed larger than any boardroom. Now he sat trembling in my office. The sight unsettled me more than I expected. Charles Hale, the man who used to stride through Beacon Hill halls with a voice that could silence rooms, was hunched forward in a chair opposite my desk, his hands restless against his knees. My mother sat beside him, pearls tight against her throat, her polished composure cracking in the fluorescent light. Snow drifted outside the hydrocore windows, flakes clinging to the glass, the world outside clean and new, while inside old debts hung heavy in the air. They had arrived unannounced, but desperation clung to them like perfume. Emily, my father began clearing his throat. We need to talk about Hale Properties, about the future. The future, I repeated, folding my arms. For years you told me mine didn't matter, and now suddenly it does because yours is collapsing. My mother leaned forward, her tone rehearsed but brittle. We made mistakes. We misjudged Daniel. We misjudged you. But surely family can put differences aside when survival is at stake. Family. The word left a bitter taste. For them, family had always been conditional, a currency to be traded love given only when it elevated their image. I glanced at Daniel beside me. He didn't speak, but his steady presence anchored me. Behind him, the hydrocore banner glowed softly, building the future with integrity. Uncle Robert leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes on me. He didn't interfere, but the small nod he gave was enough. He believed in me long before anyone else did. And Victoria, quiet in the corner, her face pale but composed, watched everything with a tension that told me she too was waiting for my answer. My father pressed on. If hydrocore would partner with us on the harborfront expansion, Daniel interrupted voice. Even calm. Harborfront is already ours, Charles. You know that. This isn't about partnership. It's about values. You built your empire on appearances. We're building ours on integrity. My mother's eyes shone, whether with tears or calculation, I couldn't tell. Emily, please. We can't lose everything. The dam inside me finally broke. My voice cut sharper than I intended, but it was the truth I had carried for decades. My wedding was not the embarrassment. My marriage was not the shame. The only disgrace is your obsession with status, the legacy of emptiness you tried to pass down. That is your inheritance, not mine. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's shoulders sagged, his face ashen. For the first time in my life, he had no words. Margaret lowered her gaze to the carpet, her pearls trembling as her chest rose and fell. It was Victoria who spoke next, her voice fragile but firm. Emily's right. I lived by your rules, and look where it got me. She's the only one here who built something real. If you can't see that, then you don't deserve her help. I turned to her stunned. For so long, she had been their golden child, their perfect creation. Now she was standing beside me, not out of rivalry, but out of recognition. Her eyes met mine, and for once there was no envy, only gratitude. My father tried to rise, then slumped back down. So that's it, he whispered. That's it, I said quietly. This isn't about saving Hale Properties, it's about saving yourselves. And that's not something Daniel or I can do for you. The snow outside thickened, the city muffled in white. I rose Daniel's hand, finding mine. Uncle Robert smiled, faintly proud. Victoria stayed seated, tears glistening, but a small, hopeful smile tugged at her lips. We walked out of the office together, leaving Charles and Margaret in their silence. The hydrocore banner swayed gently in the draft from the door, its message etched against the glass. Hydrocore, building the future with integrity. What began as a lifetime of humiliation ended with the very people who once mocked Emily, forced to face the truth in her office, stripped of their pride. Justice did not come quickly, but when it finally arrived, it shattered illusions and left no room for denial. Like a tide wearing down stone, courage met cruelty and proved that no legacy of lies can outlast the weight of truth. Sometimes all it takes is standing tall once to never bow again. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment. Your thoughts drop a 1 if you've ever felt the same injustice.